stars remain, calling out through blood and pain. Torn apart but not yet broken.
Sensible Hysteria. Book 1. Caper la Verte. Intermission. When plans meet reality.
Now, dear listeners, we have reached the moment where the best laid plans come face to face with reality. For all his careful maneuvering, for all his whispered deals and meticulous calculations, Damas ran. Oh, how easy it must have seemed when the plan was just lines on parchment, when success was inevitable, when every piece on the board moved exactly as he intended. But what Damas, like so many before him, failed to account for was the most fundamental truth of existence. No plan survives first contact with reality. And so, when the moment of failure arrived, he did not stand and fight. He did not adjust, nor did he struggle to salvage what was left. No, he ran. He left Brand, Koga, and Aang behind to face the horrors contained by the 055, the monsters locked away in depths unseen, held at bay by those who understood that some things should never be unleashed. The question is, where did these creatures come from? Were they found, captured from the dark corners of existence, hidden away in the underbelly of the city? Or, perhaps more chillingly, were they made? And if they were made, dear listeners, then we must look toward the two other great towers of the Sky Master's peaks. For it is in these monoliths of power that the foundation of Olduvai's greatness and its inevitable downfall was laid. The Tower of Innovation, a twisting, shifting spire that seems to change shape even as one looks upon it, stands as a testament to progress without restraint. It is a place where the limits of knowledge are shattered daily, where the brightest minds of the Shori Empire push ever forward, not because they must, but because they can. At the very peak of this spire sits Sky Master Castaway, the Sky Master of vicissitude, a mind so boundless that it refuses the confines of caution or limitation. Beneath him, overseeing the delicate balance between progress and destruction, is Vice Sky Master Men's Fad, whose task it is to ensure that the Empire's thirst for advancement does not consume it entirely. The tower is divided into many disciplines, each floor dedicated to a singular pursuit of knowledge: botany and mycology, where plant life and fungi are altered beyond recognition, grown into forms never meant to exist; chemistry and biochemistry, where substances are concocted that could heal an entire city or reduce it to smoldering ruin; planar research, a field so dangerous that entire floors are dedicated to the study of realms beyond our own, realms where the very laws of existence twist and break; elder gods, primal forces, divine mysteries, occult secrets, each given their own chambers, each prodded and examined like a curiosity rather than an untouchable force; clockwork and aeromancy, where machine and magic are merged into constructs that think, adapt, and evolve. These are not fields of study meant to be trifled with. These are powers, forces that have shaped worlds, that have ended civilizations. And yet, within the Tower of Innovation, such considerations are secondary. The only question ever asked within those walls is, can we? And never once do they stop to ask, should we? So tell me, dear listeners, when Brand, Koga, and Ong found themselves standing before the horrors unleashed from the depths, when they were left to fend for themselves against creatures that should not exist, where do you think those creatures came from? Did they wander in from beyond the stars? Did they crawl up from the pits of forgotten nightmares? Or were they simply born here, in the great Tower of Innovation, a test that could not be contained, a theory proven too well. And yet, for all the chaos that spills from the Tower of Innovation, it would be nothing without the cold precision of the Tower of Commerce. This tower is different. It does not shift, nor crackle with untamed energy. It is sharp, straight, unwavering, a needle piercing the sky, as though the very structure itself seeks to puncture the heavens and extract whatever wealth they contain. At its peak sits Sky Master of Coin, Eliseo Neve, the woman whose hand rests upon the city's wealth, trade, and prosperity. She does not deal in alchemical theories or forbidden knowledge. No, her science is gold, her magic is commerce. Beneath her, a legion of treasurers, financiers, and economic tacticians ensure that everything in Olduvai has a price, and that price is paid in full. Consider this, dear listeners. What is a monster to a merchant? What is a horror of flesh and shadow to a banker? It is an investment, and that more than anything should send a shiver down your spine, because for every failed experiment, every unleashed horror, every screaming abomination, there is a ledger in the Tower of Commerce that accounts for it. A contract, a budget, a transaction that ensures that someone, somewhere, has profited from its creation. The monsters of the 055. Were they captured or purchased? Were they studied or were they sold? Did some Sky Master approve their containment as a necessity for public safety? Or did someone in the high offices of the Tower of Commerce sign a contract to ensure that these horrors would one day be needed? Damas ran. He ran from something that should not have been. And Brand, Koga, and Aang were left to suffer the consequences of a deal they never made. So now, dear listeners, I ask you, how much of what we call progress is simply disaster waiting for its moment to strike? How much of what we call wealth and prosperity is built on a foundation of secrets, suffering, and the price of unchecked ambition? When the Shori soared into the sky, when they built wonders beyond mortal comprehension, did they ever look down and wonder? What will we do when it all comes crashing down? Did they ever wonder if it should? Because here is the truth, dear listeners. Damas ran because he finally saw the truth. He saw that this was never just a heist, never just a simple deal, never just another job. He saw what the Empire had hidden away. He saw what the 055 had been keeping locked beneath the surface. And when that truth came roaring to life, when it ripped free from its chains and breathed the air of a world that should never have known it, Damas did not stand and fight. He did not negotiate. He did not try to control it. He ran. And perhaps that was the only wise thing he has ever done. Because what is coming, dear listeners, what has now been set loose upon the world, it is something that neither wealth nor knowledge can contain. It is the cost of ambition. And now, Olduvai must pay.
Chapter 14. The Thing That Wears His Face.
The air was thick, suffocating, the weight of their own exhaustion pressing down on them like a grave already being filled. The corridors twisted and turned like a labyrinth of steel, and with every frantic footstep, with every desperate breath, they ran deeper and deeper into the tower's underbelly. They did not know where they were going, only that to stop moving meant death. The alarms above them screamed their metallic song, a chorus of panic echoing through the halls of the Tower of Law. The prison was in chaos, the guards scrambling, officers shouting orders, mages casting spells of defense and restraint. But the three men had no concern for them now, because something was chasing them. And it was getting closer. Their bodies, slick with sweat, were battered, burned, and bruised. Their wounds still bled. Their muscles begged for rest, but there was no rest to be found. Brand was the first to speak, though his voice came in labored gasps, his lungs grasping for air that felt too thin.
Did you...
He sucked in a breath.
Did you see that thing?
Neither Koga nor Aang slowed.
It looked like the Derhi.
Brand continued, his voice tight with lingering disbelief, as if saying it aloud might make it less real.
Horkluf, it looked like him.
Aang's jaw clenched, his fists tightening even as he ran, even as his body ached from battle.
No,
He said simply, voice sharp as broken glass.
that thing's not Horkluf.
Brand snapped his head toward him, but didn't stop running.
What the hell do you mean?
Aang's voice was firm, certain.
I fought Horkluf. I looked him in the eyes.
The thought burned in his mind. The heat of their battle, the fury behind every blow, the shared understanding between warriors locked in combat.
Horkluf was a fighter.
Aang exhaled sharply, his feet pounding against the steel floor.
He was a man.
He stole a glance over his shoulder, into the dim, flickering halls behind them. He felt it before he saw it, that awful presence pressing against his spine, like unseen claws curling toward his throat.
The thing chasing us now
His breath hitched.
is not a man anymore.
Brand wanted to argue, wanted to refute what he already knew was true. But the way Aang said it, the way the words sat heavy in the air, undeniable, absolute. Brand couldn't argue. Because it was true. The thing hunting them was not Horkluf. It was wearing him. And it was getting closer. Koga, running just behind them, said nothing, because Koga had figured something out. But he wasn't certain yet. And until he was, he kept his mouth shut. Because if he was right, if his mind wasn't lying to him, if the missing pieces of his memory were connected the way he feared, then what chased them now was worse than death itself. A sound, a heavy thud, behind them. Metal groaned, the walls shuddered. Something was moving through the corridors, something large, heavy, but wrongly fluid. Not the movement of a living thing, but something that had learned how to move. Something that was enjoying the chase. Aang pushed forward, ignoring the burn in his legs, ignoring the pain in his side from the wound he had earned in the fire. Koga's mind spun, calculations firing, trying to predict where to turn, where to hide. Brand saw the opening first.
There.
He hissed, throwing himself toward a side passage, an old control panel sticking out just beyond the threshold. Koga skidded to a stop, already prying the access panel open before Aang could even ask what the hell he was doing.
In here.
Koga snapped. Brand didn't hesitate. He dove into the vent first, forcing his aching body through the tight metal crawl space. Aang followed, his broad shoulders scraping against the walls, every inch of him burning with exertion. Koga was last, and before slipping inside, he risked one last glance down the corridor. The lights flickered, and at the far end of the hall, just past the warped shadows and the pooling darkness, a figure, a tall, hulking silhouette, standing still, watching. Then it moved, 1 foot forward. A slow, deliberate step, then another, not running. It didn't need to. Koga pulled himself into the vent, shoving the grate back into place, his heart hammering against his ribs. They sat in silence, listening, breathing, waiting. A low, dragging sound. Something was walking past the vent. Brand held his breath. Aang closed his eyes, willing his body to stillness. Koga pressed himself back against the metal, hands tight over his mouth, willing himself to disappear. The footsteps paused. For a moment, it was so quiet they could hear their own heartbeats. Then, it kept walking, moving away, but not leaving, never leaving. They waited longer than necessary before they dared to move. Bran went first, crawling forward, prying open the vent with careful, trembling hands. The corridor was empty, silent. Brand climbed out, turning back to pull Aang through, then Koga. The moment their feet hit the floor, Brand finally let out a long, shaky breath, resting his hands on his knees.
All right.
He muttered.
I think we...
Something slammed into him. A massive force, a blur of flesh and steel, sending him crashing into the ground, his head slamming against the cold metal. Aang and Koga whipped around and saw what had attacked him, saw what was left of Horkluff, or rather what now wore his face. What loomed over Brand was not the warrior Aang had fought. It was a thing of stitches and ruin, a hollowed-out husk of its former self, rebuilt in something else's image. Its wings, once mighty, were now torn and stapled back in uneven patches, held together with blackened thread and rusted wire. Its eyes, once burning with the love of battle, were now sunken voids, staring past them with a hunger that was not its own. Its chest had been carved open, a gaping wound stitched haphazardly together, as if someone had cut it apart and crudely sewn it back, caring only that it still moved. Its mouth, once used to bark orders, to laugh at the thrill of combat, was stitched into a permanent grin. It leaned forward, inhaling deep, and exhaled something that was not breath. A low, rattling sound, a groan of something dead. The moment stretched, thin as wire, every second pulled taut with anticipation, with terror, with the suffocating weight of what was about to happen. The monster that had once been Horkloof moved first. It was too fast. Brand barely had time to register the motion, the blur of rotted muscle and sinew, the stapled flesh shifting grotesquely as it lunged. Before he could move, before he could raise his sword, a hand, massive, powerful, wrong, shot forward and clamped around his throat. The cold, dead grip of something that should not be alive. Brand's breath vanished in an instant. His body was yanked off the ground, feet kicking against nothing, as the monster hoisted him up like he weighed nothing at all. And then, slam. His back hit steel, the impact sending a brutal shockwave of pain through his spine, through his ribs, his lungs, his skull. The world exploded into white static. The force of it rattled the walls, the impact ringing down the corridor like a hammer against an anvil. Brand barely had time to choke in a gasp before slam. Again, this time harder. The cold metal of the wall bit into him, the breath ripped from his lungs, his ribs protesting with sharp, flaring agony. His fingers scrabbled at the grip around his throat, trying to pry himself free, but the thing holding him was relentless. It wasn't struggling. It wasn't angry. It was just holding him, examining him, testing his limits. Like a butcher checking the quality of fresh meat, Brand coughed, vision blurring at the edges, his mind scrambling through the pain, through the suffocating heat, looking for his sword. His fingers tightened around the hilt. His arms screamed from the lack of air, from the throbbing, pulsing agony crushing his ribs. But his grip did not fail. And with the last of his strength, the last of his wild, desperate instinct, Brand drove his flaming rapier into the thing's torso. Steel met rotting flesh. The fire flared, searing into the undead horror, sending a wave of heat cascading through the corridor. The scent of burned meat filled the air. Brand expected a scream, a reaction, something, but there was nothing. No cry of pain, no stagger, no moment of weakness. The thing just twitched, its head jerking unnaturally to one side, its sunken, hollow eyes staring through him. But its grip loosened, just enough. Brand took the opening. He ripped himself free, his body dropping like dead weight onto the ground, hitting the floor with a brutal thud. His lungs gasped, desperate for air, his body reeling from the abuse. but his mind was already spinning. He was free. But his sword was still in the monster, and it didn't care. It just stood there, the blade still burning in its gut, the fire licking up its torso, the flames eating through sinew and muscle. But it didn't move to pull it out, didn't react to the pain. It just turned and began walking toward them. Brand stumbled back, knife already drawn, his breath ragged, blood leaking from his split lips. Aang took a fighter's stance, his bare hands ready, his muscles tight, his mind sharp. Koga held out a hand, fingers twitching, arcane power at his fingertips, ready to summon something, anything that might make this nightmare stop moving. The monster took a shambling step forward. The fire from the blade still burned, but it did not scream, did not flinch, did not even acknowledge the pain. Koga's voice came slow, measured, uncertain.
I think it's undead.
A cold, ugly silence filled the air. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, Brand let out a breathless, half-hysterical laugh, his voice rasping between bloody teeth.
Yeah?
He spit red onto the floor, glaring up at the stitched-up horror standing in front of them.
You don't say.
The monster took another step. The heat of the burning sword in its gut flickered, casting deep, hungry shadows against the walls. Brand tightened his grip on his knife. Aang dug his feet in. Koga muttered something under his breath, already preparing his next move. They had seconds. And the monster was still coming.
Chapter 15. No mercy for the dead.
The corridor reeked of death, the thick, choking stench of burned flesh and sweat, of blood pooling on steel, of exhaustion etched into every breath. The three of them stood their ground, battered, broken, barely clinging to consciousness. But the monster, the thing that had been Horkluff, it did not stop. It did not falter. The flames that licked its flesh, the blade buried deep in its chest, none of it mattered. It stood there, its massive, grotesque body swaying, the stapled flesh along its arms twitching, as if it was still adjusting to its own unnatural existence. Its hollow, sunken eyes locked onto them, not with rage, not with pain, but with something colder, something hungry. Brand tightened his bloody grip on his knife, his body screaming in protest. Aang stood ready to fight, his chest rising and falling in sharp, controlled breaths. Koga! Koga whispered a spell, his hands shaking, his voice a low, trembling murmur. The air shifted around them. The room changed. Shadows warped, flickering, becoming something impossible. Now there were dozens of them, dozens of Aangs, dozens of Brands, dozens of Kogas. Moving, shifting, flickering in and out of existence, a battlefield of ghosts, illusions stacked upon illusions, reality folding inward. The monster faltered. It turned its head slowly, scanning the chaos. It did not panic. It did not lash out. It simply watched. And Koga knew. It was waiting. It was figuring him out. And then, it did. Koga felt it first. That split-second lurch in the illusion. That momentary flicker where the magic unraveled just enough. And then the monster moved, faster than anything that big should be able to. Its hand shot forward, slicing through the illusions like paper, shattering the spell like glass. And it grabbed Koga by the throat. The real Koga, the one it had been waiting for. His breath vanished in an instant, a strangled, gasping choke spilling from his lips as his feet left the floor. The cold, corpse-like grip of the monster's hand crushed around his windpipe, hoisting him high. his legs kicking, struggling. Koga clawed at the thing's grip, fingers scratching at its grotesque burned flesh, but it didn't budge, didn't even acknowledge him. Like it was holding an insect, waiting for the moment to crush it completely. His chest seized, his vision darkening at the edges, panic ripping through him as he fought. Fought to breathe, fought to cast, fought to move. He raised a hand, his magic sparking at his fingertips, lips moving, trying to whisper one last spell, one last escape, one last chance. The monster pulled him closer. Koga's wide, panicked eyes met the sunken voids of its stare, and then the thing smiled. Not a smirk, not a snarl, just that permanent stretched grin, stitched at the corners, a horrible mockery of joy, and it ripped him apart. Flesh tore, bone snapped. A horrible, sickening sound filled the room, the sound of a body being split like wet fabric, of organs spilling onto metal. Aang lunged forward,
No.
but it was too late. Koga's mouth opened, as if to speak, but nothing came out. His body collapsed in pieces, his blood painting the walls, the floors, the monster's hands. His magic still flickered on his twitching fingers. And then he was gone. Aang's body locked up, his mind screaming, something inside him snapping apart. But there was no time. No time to mourn, no time to grieve, because the monster was already standing again, and it wasn't finished. The monster was still standing. Even with its body riddled with wounds, even with fire licking at its flesh, even with Koga's blood still dripping from its twisted hands, it refused to die. Aang roared and charged first, ignoring the blinding pain that rippled through his ribs, the sharp, stabbing ache of his broken bones, the burns that blistered along his arms. He threw himself at the thing that had killed Koga, his fist colliding with its jaw, the impact sending a wet, cracking noise through the room. But it didn't react, didn't stumble, didn't even flinch. It lashed back, and Aang barely had time to block before the monster's massive arms slammed into his side, the impact crushing his already broken ribs, sending him collapsing to the floor with a pained, strangled gasp. It was too strong. It wasn't slowing down. It was going to kill them both. Brand saw the opening, saw the cracked seam at the base of its neck, the way the flesh there folded unnaturally, like stitched-up leather ready to tear. He gritted his bloody teeth, moved through the fire and wreckage, rolling under the monster's next wild swing, positioning himself behind it just close enough. And then, with one sharp, practiced motion, he plunged his knife into its eye. The blade sank deep, piercing into the dark, sunken void, and for the first time, the monster screamed. A soundless, guttural wail, a twisting, horrible noise that sounded like something trying to remember how to be human. Its body convulsed violently, its stitches straining against its own monstrous weight, its head whipping back in agony. Brand yanked the knife free, his hands slick with blackened blood, and then he saw it, his rapier still embedded in its burning chest, still waiting for him. He moved fast, pushing through the pain, through the ache in his bones, through the exhaustion dragging at his limbs. And with a final, desperate motion, he ripped the blade free. Fire flared, embers spitting from the wound, the monster's body twisting in pain as it let out another horrible, soundless howl. But it still wouldn't stop. It turned toward Brand, its one remaining eye locking onto him, and he knew it was going to kill him. It was going to rip him apart, just like Koga. It moved. Brand braced for the end. And then
Brand the crates.
Aang's voice cut through the chaos, rough, broken, but desperate. Brand whipped his head to the side, saw what Aang was pointing at, and he knew exactly how to end this.
Perfect!
The monster lunged. Brand rolled toward the explosives, dodging just as clawed fingers swiped where his throat had been. Aang, with everything he had left, used his last ounce of strength to grab onto the thing's mutilated leg, pulling it back, forcing it just a second too late. Just long enough. Brand spun, sword still blazing, and he drove the rapier into the exposed fuse. The flame kissed the gunpowder. The monster turned, its stitched grin frozen, its hands reaching. Brand, bloodied, broken, breathing heavy, grinned right back.
Burn in hell, you bastard.
Boom! The explosion consumed the room. The heat devoured everything. A wave of blinding fire and shrapnel tearing through the space, swallowing metal, flesh, and bone alike. The shockwave slammed into them, throwing Brand and Aang against the far wall, their bodies hitting the steel with a sickening impact. The room collapsed inward, the sound of breaking steel and fire roaring into the darkness. Then, finally, there was nothing. No more stitching, no more screams. The monster was dead. Smoke filled their lungs. Aang coughed, forcing himself onto his hands and knees, every inch of him burning, breaking, failing. His ribs were crushed, his muscles torn, his body barely holding together. Brand groaned somewhere beside him, his hands shaking, his face streaked with blood and soot, but his chest still moving. They had won, they had survived, but it didn't feel like victory, because Koga was gone. The room was destroyed, the floor warped from the blast, the wreckage still smoldering with dying embers, and scattered among the ruin. The only pieces of their friend that remained. Aang moved first, his limp dragging, his bones grinding against each other as he staggered toward the burned wreckage of Koga's last stand. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. He reached down, fingers brushing over torn fabric, lifting what was left of Koga's jacket, the edges blackened from the explosion. Brand moved next, his steps slow, careful, almost uncertain, as he bent down and picked up Koga's emerald necklace from the ash-covered steel. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of alarms echoing through the ruined corridors. Brand finally exhaled.
He'd probably be pissed we're standing here like this.
Aang let out a breath that might have been a laugh, but it was too empty, too exhausted to be anything but a hollow attempt at humor. He turned over the half-burned jacket in his hands, staring at it for a long moment. Finally, he muttered, voice rough and quiet.
Yeah.
That was all. That was all that needed to be said. Koga was gone, and they were still alive. But the job wasn't over. Not yet. Not till Damas answered for this.